Whether you're being hunted down in the haunted hallways of a fictional prison or trying to escape the recesses of your own mind, which comes in the form of a dreary asylum, October is certainly the month to get into touch with your spookier side. And that's why Fulcrum Publishing and developer Bite Barrel have teamed up to deliver the latest in blood-soaked insanity, Forgive Me Father 2, which just launched its full 1.0 release over on Steam, GOG, and EGS. This sequel focuses on the priest who survived the events of the first game in a physical sense, but his mind not so much, and now has no choice but to delve into the Lovecraftian nightmare once more. With 24 unique weapons spread across both melee and ranged, with some of them getting very tentacly, along with 18 active and 22 passive powers you can unlock via the new Dark Tome, you're going to have plenty of options to take on hordes of enemies and the 4 grotesque bosses that command them. And if you want to experience cutting and blasting a bloody swath with all those powers unlocked, you can do so in New Game Plus mode so you can relive the horror again and again. So, if you're interested in going a little mad, check the links in the description and pinned comment below. Thanks again to Fulcrum and Bite Barrel for sponsoring today's episode. And without further ado, let's commence the suffering. Welcome back to another terrifying and/or electrifying episode of What Happened, the YouTube-style pop culture media show that's nearly done with spooky October-coded content. And really, you can't get much spookier than the gore-filled hallways of Abbott State Correctional Facility, the haunted prison from Midway's attempt to cut its own slice of the survival horror pie. As I've covered exhaustively in the past, Midway was obsessed with chasing the trends of console gaming, as it was desperate to shed its arcade roots and adopt a more sustainable long-term business plan, which, didn't work. Be that as it may, its entry into the survival horror genre, which was developed by Surreal Software, did make a splash when it first released, only for the promising franchise to be executed and buried in record time. So, time to grab your shiniest shiv and shottiest shotgun as I answer the question, what happened to the suffering?
Your soul is strong, T.
Founded in 1995 in Seattle, Washington, Surreal Software made a name for themselves with the Drakan series, which revolved around 3D dragon-based adventuring on both the PC and consoles. 2002 was a particularly busy year for them, as they released not only the second Drakan title, The Ancient Gates, but Lord of the Rings for the PS2. No, not that one. This one! Remember there was that short-lived brouhaha between Tolkien Enterprises and New Line Cinema, where the rights between adapting the films and the original novels were all over the place? Yeah, that resulted in this far more book-accurate adaptation, but sadly, it did not review or is remembered as well as the seminal Two Towers beat-em-up, a rare Electronic Arts W. But all these 3D console games helped Surreal hone their technology, and it wasn't too long before they were looking to develop a horror game of their own, as the genre was still thriving with the likes of Resident Evil and Silent Hill. To really get to the dark and twisted origins of the project, though, I spoke to Richard Rouse III, who served as the designer of the first game, as well as the director of its sequel, The Ties That Bind. Richard explained how it happened to be a fortunate coincidence that both Surreal and Midway were looking to expand their horizons at around the same time. Midway had a long history making games that pushed the boundaries in terms of violence. Mortal Kombat is obviously a big one, but also games like Narc or Carnival. Even Smash TV is surprisingly violent. They had interest in a horror game to round out the gory lineup, and fortunately we wanted to make one too. Surreal had just made the Drakan games, and we leveraged our third-person engine and the skills the team had built up with making third-person games to then pitch them The Suffering, called Unspeakable originally, and then dive right into development. In these very early days, Unspeakable was being designed to be something more akin to Silent Hill rather than the action horror angle that The Suffering would ultimately take. This is also the first time I've ever heard of an alternate name for the franchise before, as I guess nobody really wanted to speak about it. Richard would go on to state, however, that the team felt at some point that it was perhaps a bit too reminiscent of Silent Hill, and thus took a different tact, which included setting the game within the haunted hallways of a prison. Once that was set in stone, Surreal began building things from there, but unlike the final game's unique selling points, it could be played completely in third or first person. It took a while for things to evolve to that point. With the experience they had gained from their earlier third-person efforts, their first inclination was to stick exclusively with what they knew, and to keep the camera firmly behind the protagonist, in this case the moody man of few words, Torque. However, the team eventually wanted to show off the props, textures, and other environmental flourishes throughout the prison, and with greater detail. Thus, they implemented a camera system much like those seen in 3D Zelda games or the original Metal Gear Solid, where the player would be able to initiate a first-person view to get a better look at their surroundings. But then it was decided to why not just let the player explore and fight through Abbott's state in this perspective if they so choose. Thus, one of the Suffering's main bullet points became a reality. Something that was a little less from reality, though, was one of Midway's marketing claims, which purported that Hollywood SFX legend, the late Stan Winston, was going to be designing all the monsters, which, in typical Midway fashion, was not accurate at all. Midway trying to sidle up to Hollywood talent wasn't anything new. From notable voice roles in Area 51 to John Woo's Stranglehold, music videos for Mortal Kombat and PsyOps, and finally culminating in the very costly cancellation of the Snoop Dogg starring Fear and Respect. It should be no surprise then that the same trick was employed on The Suffering, but Mr. Rouse informed me that it didn't add to the project as much as Midway's marketing department would have you believe. Stan Winston was the Hollywood person that was added to The Suffering, and I think mostly just to tick that box. But to be honest, the contract with Stan Winston Studios took so long to get done. By the time we met with Stan Winston and his team, we had already designed all of our creatures. Stan was great to talk to though, clearly someone who wanted to push for quality and love creature design. I remember I was really excited that Stan liked what we had done with the creatures a lot. That is, except for the first version of the Insanity Mode creature, which he said wasn't in the same style as everything else, and he thought it should be. We thought about it and we agreed he was right, so we redid that key creature and made it fit the game a lot better, but the designs and concepts for all the creatures were done by our team. Now that is Midway as all hell, I can tell you for free. Anyway, Surreal had other issues when it came down to designing combat, in that they had never worked on a game where firearms were a central pillar. Remember, before Resident Evil 4 would popularize the over-the-shoulder camera perspective, it was still the Wild West when it came to third-person shooters. Every game was doing something slightly different, but few were seen as ideal. Surreal Software's first attempt was to go for a more automatic lock-on system, with Richard citing Siphon Filter as the nearest parallel. However, after extensive testing, they felt the combat simply wasn't very satisfying, and decided they needed to rework the whole thing so it would feel good on a controller. So they looked to both Halo and Max Payne 2, which had just come out on consoles, for inspiration. Speaking of consoles, some of you out there may have noticed that when The Suffering originally released, it was on 2 of the 3 major machines available at that time, so I regret to inform you, and when I say you I mean diehard Nintendo fans, that initially a GameCube version was planned, but ultimately never released. I remember wondering how Control would work with this similar but different GameCube controller, but partway through our development, I think several Midway GameCube releases had not sold well, and we dropped doing a GameCube version. When we shipped the game, Nintendo was in a bit of a slump. We never got to the point of discussing handheld versions. Midway didn't have much of an appetite for those, but I was bummed the GameCube was dropped because I never shipped a game on a Nintendo system, and I wanted to. Fortunately, aside from that, Surreal didn't have much in the way of content that needed to be cut out, which is pretty rare as far as my experience covering game development goes. Richard did clarify there was one section that was in their original plans, but they decided against including it before work had ever even started. Of all the games I worked on, the original Suffering had the least amount of cut content. We had plans for things we were going to include, but we didn't end up implementing very much of it. We cut stuff on paper, which is when you want to do it, because it saves a lot of money versus cutting things you worked on for a while. One of the paper cuts was a whole town on Carnate Island, which is where the corrections officer Ernesto lived. In the game, when you separate from Ernesto, he runs off to the town to check on his family, but you can't follow because a wall of flame blocks your way. Originally, you were going to go with him to the town and face more terrors there. Please note that Richard singled out the first Suffering as the game which had the least amount of stuff left on the cutting room floor, something that could not be said about its sequel, The Ties That Bind. In stark contrast to the original, Surreal's second sentence with Torque had a very rushed development, as Midway was rapidly trying to change its business model once again in the wake of changing trends, which unfortunately cut off the Suffering franchise at its very knees. When The Suffering was finally unleashed on store shelves in March of 2004, it proved to be quite the commercial success, something that Richard was able to confirm with me. I don't have the exact figures, but yes, it was successful, and that's why it got the sequel. I believe it was the most successful action-adventure title Midway had done up to that time, certainly the best-selling original one. As stated earlier in the video, Richard was promoted to director for the sequel, but unfortunately the project was immediately hammered with a very aggressive release date, which was part of Midway's new, much worse marketing strategy. Do you happen to recall a vague quote or announcement from the mid-2000s where the house that Scorpion and Sub-Zero built said that annual releases were in the cards for all their major franchises, with Mortal Kombat cited as the prime example, with Deception releasing in 2004, Shaolin Monks in 2005, and Armageddon in 2006? Yeah, Midway wanted to do that with everything, which really wasn't sustainable nor realistic. So, Ties That Bind was originally supposed to be made in just 14 months from the original game. We ended up needing a bit more time, but the turnaround was still very quick. I do wish we had taken more time and done a bigger game as a sequel and done it as an Xbox 360/PS3 launch title. There were much more cuts and reworking for the sequel, which is counter to what you would expect for a sequel being made in a hurry. But we did manage to ship most of what we made, we just rearranged it. Originally, the whole Blackmore villain wasn't supposed to be a hallucination of Torque. That was something we added after 6 months or so of development. There were a lot of changes, but to be honest, I don't remember it nearly as well as the first game. It's more of a blur. Before The Ties That Bind would even release though, Midway were already transitioning Surreal Software into a very different direction. The massive success of the 3D GTA trilogy caused them to essentially pivot almost everything into that style of crime-focused, vehicle-heavy gameplay. This, of course, can clearly be seen in the aforementioned Fear and Respect, The Wheelman, and of course, the infamous This Is Vegas. Surreal Software were given the Herculean task of creating a completely open-world version of Sin City for next-generation hardware, while they were still trying to finish up the Suffering sequel. But by then, Midway were no longer interested in horror, as the top execs now believed it was a dying genre. This was then reflected in the marketing, or lack thereof, and the very unfortunate release date that The Ties That Bind would have to grapple with, September 28th, 2005. This was just 2 days before Midway's own Mortal Kombat Shaolin Monks came out, and only a week after Ultimate Spider-Man, X-Men Legends 2, Marvel Nemesis, and not to mention that the Xbox 360 was coming very soon. Critically, The Ties That Bind was received in much the same way that the first game had been from magazines and websites just a year earlier, hovering in the high 70s, but commercially it did far worse, which is typically the end-all be-all for any Midway franchises at that time. There were even plans for a feature film, directed by Stan Winston no less. Hell yeah, he would have brought that pumpkin head magic back. But those plans quickly fell through once Midway decided to move on. Thus, Surreal were moved exclusively onto developing This Is Vegas, which remains one of, if not the biggest money sink in Midway's history, costing them $60 million with nothing to show for it. I asked Richard about his time in Sin City, but since the suffering was the focus of this video, we only touched upon it briefly. Midway really wanted bigger games than the suffering. Horror was seen as niche, and with the Xbox 360/PS3 generation and the bigger budgets that came with those games, we would have needed bigger sales to support them. This wasn't in any way a decision I was involved with, but we worked with the direction we were given. That said, we did like the different challenges that This Is Vegas brought with it. Now, there's a game that had a lot of direction changes and cut content, but that's a story for another time. Well, if you'd like to make that another time right now, well, you can't do better than Liam Robertson's extensive deep dive on all things This Is Vegas, the link to which you'll find in the description below. Now, if I can take a second to personally interject here, I think the handling of the suffering was one of Midway's biggest blunders, in that it really could have grown to be something greater than a quick horror cash grab that the Midway execs evidently viewed it as. If the sequel had been given the time, marketing budget, and been made a next-gen exclusive, like Richard had said, I have no doubt it would have done far better. And if a third game had ever been greenlit, it could have focused on a whole new scenario with a new cast of characters, exploring other dark and twisted corners of the world, introduced co-op, and really play into the action horror vibe, and hell, it might have even gotten a bit ahead of the path Resident Evil eventually took. Of course, much like every Midway franchise outside of Mortal Kombat, this is yet another series that WB Games just sits on and does absolutely nothing with, so I don't expect to see it escape from its own personal IP prison anytime soon, so all of you Torque fans out there will just have to continue to suffer. Thanks again to Richard for taking the time to speak to me for today's episode. And if you'd like to see some of his more recent works, check out his cult investigating action-adventure thriller, The Church in the Darkness. And if you know of any other troubled developments in the video game or movie industries, let me know in the comments below, or head on over to the stinky cell block that is my social media. See you next time, and thanks for watching!